Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining this webinar on cybersecurity. My name is Jamie Foster. I'm a partner at Hill Dickinson and a member of the cyber security team. Delighted to bring you the first webinar, hopefully of many others to come, focusing on cybersecurity. And the intention of this session is really to give a bit of an overview of where we are on the regulatory landscape and provide some very practical tips as to how to deal with preventing, and if you do happen to be subject to a cyber attack, dealing with it. So hopefully there'll be lots of clear practical tips that you can take away from this session. A few housekeeping points to note are on the slide here. Excuse me, microphones are muted, cameras are automatically switched off. If you have any questions, please do drop them in the chat and we'll either pick them up at the end of each of the sessions or at the end during the Q&A. Very much welcome questions. The session is being recorded. The slides will be circulated with the recording after the event. We are aware that there's been an update to Teams recently, which has led to some people not being able to see slides. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that if that is the case. But as I say, the slides will be circulated afterwards anyway. So the running order for the morning during this short session is, first of all, delighted to welcome Andy Watkin-Child of Parava Security Solutions, who's going to set the context really and just tell us where we are both globally and in the UK on cybersecurity and risk management, what's happening with the regulatory environment. It's changing very quickly. Andy's going to briefly bring us up to speed on that. Then we've got Aoife Ryan from Hill Dickinson talking about prevention. Prevention is better than cure, how to prevent a cybersecurity attack. And then Kate Steele, also from Hill Dickinson, talking about what to happen if you are the victim of an attack. And finally, we have Jenny Wade from our health team, who's going to give us a bit of a case study about some cyber attacks that have happened in the health and care sector. And as I say, at the end, Q&A. So hopefully that sounds like a very informative and interesting agenda. And without further ado, I will pass over to Andy for the first session. Andy, if you'd like to take control of the slides.
Yes, hopefully I can. I will do my best to move through the slides. Given the challenge I think we've probably got with I can't actually page forward. I don't have control, but if you could actually page forward for me, Jamie, that would be great. But if you could just go back to the slide above to start off with, thank you. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you for inviting me along today and through the work we've been doing yourselves over the last 6 months. And the papers that we've written together. It's great to be here. Where we are today, in terms of cybersecurity, if you've been in cyber as long as I have, for about 25 years, we're actually in a really unprecedented time. Cybersecurity, for the last 20 years, has been really much a fair uncertainty and doubt debate outside of non-regulated industries such as financial services. If you are in financial services, then organisations will spend a lot of time implementing cyber. But cyber is now turning into a national security issue. It's very clearly recognised by sub-nation states, US, EU, Australia being notable ones, that cyber is a significant issue. To the point now where the significant rise in cyber attacks over the last sort of 2 to 3 years has created a paradigm shift in how nation states are viewing cyber. To the extent where Claire O'Neill of Australian government said this week that cyber security is very clearly a national security, corporate security and societal security issue that needs to be addressed. And they are working very much on addressing that. I'm going to go through today quickly some of the regulations that is out there and sort of implications on corporate governance. Could we move to the next slide, please? So if we look at the regulatory environment as it stands, certainly, in terms of new regulation that is coming out, let's focus on the US and the EU. The US has already maintained cyber regulation for a number of years. It started with the Federal Information Security Modernization Act back in 2002 that impacts federal government and federal agencies, requiring them to implement cyber. It also implemented DFARS regulations for the defence industry back in 2017, and that regulation primarily impacts global defence suppliers supplying defence weapon systems to the US. It does include UK defence contractors. October 2023, we're going to see the formal implementation of the FDA's cybersecurity regulations for medical devices. And that's going to require medical device manufacturers globally to implement cybersecurity and risk management before the FDA will take them on. And that's going to create a number of challenges for those organisations because they're going to have to implement cybersecurity and risk management. At the beginning of October, we had the White House Office of National Cyber Directorate. They implemented or introduced, and then are going to implement their cybersecurity risk management national strategy. That will impact all the federal government and US organisations and organisations that will be trading with the United States. And finally, we have the Securities and Exchange Commission cybersecurity risk management proposal. There is an expectation that will get introduced in May to June this year. And if that does get introduced formally, it will impact any organisation on a US exchange, a publicly traded firm, and they will have to implement those organisations' cybersecurity risk management. The EU has been taking a very active stance over the last year on cybersecurity. It introduced both the EU NIS2 and Digital Operational Resilience Act onto the European Journal in January this year, with 2 years for national governments to implement cybersecurity. And it's working currently on what is called the Cyber Resilience Act, which is implementing cybersecurity into devices or requiring the manufacturers and distributors of ICT products and services, things like IoT, cloud, network infrastructure, and other digital ICT services and products that are sold and distributed in the EU. And this week there was an announcement of something called the Cyber Solidarity Act, proposed, which is being developed. And this is an act that's looking to coordinate cybersecurity across EU member states, looking at introducing security operations centres at an EU nation-state level, and also coordinating better cybersecurity education, risk management, and an overall integration of cybersecurity certification, and looking at certifying individuals in cybersecurity if they're going to provide products and services in the EU. Next slide, please. Cyber regulation here and now for the UK. Obviously, most of you will have heard about the regulations that are in front of us here, whether it's the Computer Misuse Act, UK DPA, GDPR, and UK NIS1. We also have Cyber Essentials, and we have the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act that is now coming into force. That has got a lot of similarities to the EU CRA. So, we do have regulation here, but to be clear, it's not as in any way as strict or as stringent as the regulation that is being proposed in the EU or in the US. And we're really going to have to start to consider, I think, as the UK, how we develop our own cybersecurity regulation to remain in line with our partners across the globe. Certainly, because the regulations being developed outside of the United Kingdom will impact companies trading with EU, Australia, and that's going to create a number of challenges, I think. In addition to the above that we've already talked about, we do have US DFARS 252, 204, 7, 12, 19, and 20. Do apply to contractors that are supplying US DoD weapon systems. It's been around since 2017, updated in 2020, and potentially, as something called the CMMC program, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, that is being embedded into federal acquisition regulations as we speak. If that happens, then organisations trading with the DoD will be required to have a certificate of cybersecurity conformity before the DoD will issue a contract. Obviously, we've talked about the FDA medical device requirements. That again is here and now, and we'll start in October 2023, and require UK firms that are supplying medical devices to the US to have a strict cybersecurity program to be able to identify vulnerabilities in their systems that are being sold as medical devices, and ensure there's a proactive program around incident reporting, as well as vulnerability mitigation. And obviously we have EU GDPR. We also have to consider if we're trading in Europe. Next slide, please. And again. So what are the implications? Well, the implications are quite significant of the regulatory landscape down the line. First of all, to be clear, we often talk about cybersecurity. Well, a lot of the regulation is now talking about cybersecurity risk management, and that is a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift in a number of ways. One, it's going to require organisations to implement the cybersecurity framework, and that's going to require organisations to understand their cybersecurity risks, as well as be about security standards to mitigate those risks. They're going to have to demonstrate that that is in place. Certainly with the SEC proposal, boards are going to have to demonstrate that they are managing cybersecurity risks and that they've got cybersecurity risk management governance in place and the relevant reporting. Cybersecurity is a very complex area to work in. There's a lot of control. Organisations are going to have to demonstrate that, and they're going to have to demonstrate that and report that and attest that to the Security and Exchange Commission. EU NIS2 has got some similarities in terms of risk management, also reporting, and also with EU NIS2, for example, the proposal brings in ex ante and ex post oversight, so that would allow local regulators to turn up and audit automatically. I'm trying to get closer to the mic. So if that's better, I hope that's a little bit better. Qualification and knowledge is going to be required. They're going to have to demonstrate that they understand cybersecurity and they've been educated, and they have the relevant education programs in place as well. As individuals understand and can demonstrate that they are providing effective oversight and assurance of cyber.
Apologies, Andy. Andy, it's becoming quite difficult to hear you. I think everybody else is finding that, but see what you can do just to be a bit closer to the mic. I think
is that better?
That does sound a bit better, yeah.
Right, shall I do it that way? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So cyber regulatory compliance. In fact, what I'll do is let me just switch that off. I'll switch the camera off. So cyber regulatory compliance is going to be a significant challenge for organisations. Organisations are going to have to implement a cybersecurity risk management framework and program, and they're going to have to demonstrate that to regulators both in the EU and in the US. They're going to have to demonstrate that they've got appropriate cybersecurity risk management governance, and the relevant cybersecurity policies and procedures are in place. And that will open themselves up to oversight, and they're also going to have to attest that to regulators, certainly in the case of the SEC proposal in EU NIS2 and DORA. They're going to have to report cyber incidents in a timely fashion. SEC proposal is 4 days, EU NIS2 is less than a day. And they're going to have to implement independent oversight and assurance and attestation through something like a 3-line of defense model, where they've got internal audit and external audit providing oversight and assurance of cybersecurity risk management compliance. For those that didn't hear me before, I just want to make the point again that the regulatory environment is changing so much that we're now moving to a cybersecurity risk-based approach for cybersecurity, which is different to cybersecurity in itself. We've spent a lot of time managing cybersecurity as an event right of bang. rather than, which we mean after the incident, rather than implementing the necessary policies, procedures and controls left of bang. And that's what regulation will drive. Next slide, please. So what does that mean in implications for corporate governance? This is something we've worked on within the US, and we've worked on within financial services. From my perspective, it's going to require a robust corporate governance framework and model to implement cyber. And that's following something like a three-line of defense model, which is well known in financial services. It's also going to make cybersecurity a regulatory compliance risk, and it's going to involve a lot more conversations with general counsel, internal and external counsel, because it's a regulatory compliance issue. There's going to be a lot more oversight and assurance needed of cybersecurity. That's going to bring legal into the conversation, as well as risk, compliance, and audit to oversight and assure cybersecurity. And that's going to be a significant challenge both for the legal industry, the audit community, and boards, because they're going to have to demonstrate good corporate governance over cyber and ensure that that whole mechanism is in place to oversight cybersecurity in the organisation, all the way up to reporting to the board, and for the board to be able to report back to regulators, which is going to take better oversight and assurance. And next slide, please. So, my advice now is we've got to skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. It's a well-known consultancy quote. We don't have the time in the UK with the regulatory paradigm that's being driven in the US and the EU to start to really think this is a FUD debate anymore. While we may not be regulating quickly in the UK, we're certainly regulating quickly outside of the UK, and that will impact UK organisations. I think the next slide is really a bio for me. If anybody wants to know a little bit more about me, I won't go through that. And now pass back to you, Jamie. And again, sorry for the line. I have to say it's probably a Teams thing. I was on a call this morning and it seemed to work.
Yep, thank you very much, Andy. Very helpful. Hopefully, despite the issues with the sound, everybody could hear Andy's message loud and clear about the increasing regulation in this area. So great to hand over now to Aoife, who's going to talk a bit about prevention and how we deal with that. Aoife, if you want to take control. Oh, you're on mute.
Help if I can get the basics right. Thank you for that introduction, Jamie, and thank you, Andy. Good morning, everyone. I'm Aoife Ryan. I'm a legal director within Hill Dickinson's Regulatory Services Group, and I'm also a member of the cyber security team. What I want to talk to you this morning about is largely from a regulatory perspective, rather than dealing with regulation, but simply from a regulatory eye as to how things are likely to pan out in the UK. Andy's given us a lot of detail about both the US and the EU. My discussion this morning is more UK based. Really, what I would like to expand upon is the concept that prevention is better than cure. So really, what are we talking about? What is cybersecurity? What's it all about? And in very basic terms, any organisation who is relying on digital technology or who retains data in an electronic form needs to have measures in place that are suitable and sufficient to prevent those devices or systems being the subject of an attack and consequently being compromised. It's usually the case that cybersecurity is considered to be the provenance of the IT team, but actually, in fact, it falls on the shoulders of all staff members to be responsible both for cybersecurity, but also to provide cyber resilience, to identify potential risks and ensure that appropriate action is taken with the systems that are in place within the organisation. So what's the risk of an attack? The obvious risk, a loss of information, unable to access business systems, leading to business disruption, potential financial loss, reputational damage, loss of clients, and ultimately the risk of a fine from the Information Commissioner's Office in the event of a data breach. And I think both Kate and Jenny will talk in greater detail about those risks. and the implications can be fairly significant, in fact, often devastating to a business, given the levels of fines that have been imposed in the past. So the question really is not just security, but it's also resilience. So is your organisation resilient? I've already touched upon the fact that it is the responsibility of everybody within the organisation, but it is actually something that the guidance indicates should be led from the top down. So it is board level engagement. You'll be familiar with this from looking at approaches to health and safety, dealing with anti-money laundering, anti-bribery. It's the same type of approach. Board must understand the risks, undertake an appropriate assessment of those risks, identify how those risks can be managed, and cascade that down throughout the organisation. And those processes should be embedded. So within any risk management considerations, they should be not viewed as a standalone IT problem, a bolt-on, but as something that should be done throughout all reviews. Is cybersecurity something that we've looked at in the same way that you would look at health and safety? Are we refreshing our thoughts on this? Is there information? Has there been discussion within the organisation of people's individual experiences? Often you'll find that there are particular weaknesses within an organisation. Have those perhaps sometimes some to the first point of contact? Front of house are often considered a vulnerable area. Have those risks been assessed? Have the staff been engaged and trained as how to deal with any potential risks? So what you are seeking to develop in essence is a security culture, everybody taking joint responsibility. And if that security culture can be established, then what you are left with is an organisation which is confident in its ability to both detect any potential risks to security, but also to act swiftly and reduce any damage that a business may be facing as a consequence of those risks. There are a number of tools which should assist an organisation in preparing themselves and ensuring that there are appropriate systems and procedures in place. Those are identified in perhaps very good detail by way of bullet point by the UK government and the National Cybersecurity Centre, who are part of GCHQ. They have a very useful website which provides a guide for boards, some very helpful training videos which are extremely accessible, and they have set out I think it is, what are we, nine points in which a business can essentially arm themselves with the ability to rebut the risk of cyber attack. So looking at those in turn, the obvious one, risk management. Assess your risk, know where your vulnerabilities are. Engagement and training, ensuring that all staff are aware of the risk to cybersecurity and are appropriately trained in the event that something or someone attempts to infiltrate the business systems. Know what your data is, know how your systems operate, ensure that they have been designed, built and managed appropriately, that they have been updated, make sure that the systems are protected, who can see what, where, who has access, who has control to the data that the business holds. I've mentioned previously protecting particularly vulnerable data. How are incidents logged? How are incidents monitored? Are they reviewed? Is there an incident management system in place? Is there a clear plan of how to respond, and are all staff aware of it? And finally, your supply chain. What inquiries have you made with your suppliers and partners? What information are they permitted to access? How do they access that through the systems? What safeguards are in place? I think it's particularly of note that we're having this seminar this morning because, in fact, Oliver Dowden, who is the Secretary of State for National Investment Security, is attending the NCSE conference in Belfast. And I understand from yesterday's Financial Times that he has said that there is an emerging Wagner-like cyber groups attempting to cause maximum damage to the UK's critical national infrastructure. And at the conference today, the NCSC are considering issuing an official threat notice. So it's going to be a call to arms for UK businesses to strengthen their cybersecurity, that particularly with a focus to security which is likely to impact on national infrastructure. But of course, that will apply equally to all businesses. If the risk is focused currently on national infrastructure, there is no doubt that it will cascade out across the UK, where businesses are being targeted by hackers. So practically speaking, what can you do? Again, I've talked about risk assessments. They have to be meaningful. It isn't a tick box exercise. You need to seriously consider the organisation, consider where the weakness is, and ensure that there are appropriate measures and controls, policies and procedures in place to address those. If necessary, if you feel that you don't have sufficient understanding or sufficient expertise in-house, seek assistance from expert external technical experts who can devise a system, for you, who can provide training and support. Ensure that your systems are backed up on a daily basis. Ensure that that backup is kept separate, cloud storage perhaps, where it can be accessed if the worst were to happen, and that you can quickly reinstall and re-establish your data, and ensure that you have up-to-date antivirus software, which again is regularly maintained, updated, making sure that it has been installed, and that staff members are aware if they are using devices which allow them to access business data are also updated. And in relation to those devices, certainly there should be at least a two-factor authentication process and a requirement that their equipment is up to date. I can tell you from my own personal experience that is something that Hill Dickinson have, and I fell foul of it last week when I attempted to access my emails on my mobile phone and discovered that because I hadn't updated the latest Apple security, my app had been deleted, and it took somewhat of a headache to reinstall it. But clearly that means that I'm live to it. If staff know that if you don't do what is required of you in line with policy to ensure that data is safe and secure, the consequences are you lose access to that data. I think it's a fairly sharp and swift lesson. Similarly, training, which we've talked about, staff should have practical experience of how they can identify phishing attacks. It's the best form of understanding is by way of examples, so that those who don't consider themselves particularly technically sophisticated, I count myself as one of those people, can understand and recognise what a phishing attack, phishing email may look like, and that they have the confidence that they can report any suspicious activity without feeling that they are likely to come under some form of criticism for doing so. So it is building cyber resilience into the organisation and building confidence in staff that they know what to do were the worst case to arise. Which takes us on to worst case scenario. The most frequent reports of cyber attacks have come from phishing attempts. The Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS, report that 39% of UK businesses say that has been the cause of attacks, phishing attempts. Only 1 in 5 have said they have been more sophisticated, for example, malware or ransomware. And I think a very good example of how a phishing email can impact upon a business is the case of Interserve, who are a construction company, and back in 2020 they were the victim of a cyber attack. What happened was hackers gained access through the phishing email. One employee, not recognising it was a phishing email, forwarded it on to another, who unwittingly then downloaded the malware, which regrettably led to the exposure of 113,000 staff members' personal sensitive details, bank details, national insurance numbers. The criticism was levied at them by the fact that although they had quarantined the malware, their systems were insufficient to then ensure that further investigation was undertaken. And as a consequence of their poor incident response, they found themselves on the wrong side of the Information Commissioner's office and were the victim of a fine of £4.4 million. So clearly, that just goes to show precisely how seriously these breaches can be taken and the importance of having policies, procedures, processes, systems, training and assessing your risk. That's all from me this morning. I shall pass you on to Kate Steele, who I think will talk further about the Information Commissioner's approach to data. I hope that's been of assistance. Thank you.
Thanks, Aoife, and morning, everyone. So very quick introduction from me. My name's Kate Steele. I'm a partner in Hill Dickinson's commercial litigation team. I'm also a data protection practitioner. So I advise clients on data security breaches, and I've advised on a number of cyber attacks, unfortunately, for clients. So I'm going to run through the key points that you ought to be considering if you do fall victim to an attack. I've got 10 minutes with my colleagues, so it's going to be quite high level and hopefully very practical. Oh. There we go. Oh no, sorry. There we go. Slide moved. Okay, so as Aoife's discussed, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, will have an incident response plan in place. Perhaps you're in the process of putting one together. But very generally, that's going to cover these three areas in the immediate aftermath of a response plan. So assembling a team of people who need to know or need to help you, reviewing what's happened and what you need to do now, and then managing the attack, including, very importantly, containing the damage. That's not a fixed process. You'll go through those steps more than once, I expect. You'll go back and forth between steps. The important thing is that you're reacting to the crisis you're faced with in the best interests of your organisation and with the information you have at any one time, which will no doubt change as the crisis unfolds. So first things first, usually what will happen is someone within your organisation will be put on notice that you've suffered a cyber attack. It might be obvious to everyone that there's been an incident, but that's not necessarily the case. It may just be a random employee who can't open his or her laptop. It may be that they've realised they've opened an email that looks a bit dodgy, or IT might be able to spot an anomaly in the system. Some data seems to have gone missing. Hopefully you've got the right policies in place. Hopefully the staff have the training to identify these issues so that the message gets very quickly to the right person within your organisation to initiate your response. If you don't have a nominated lead to deal with a cybersecurity incident, then I'd suggest you appoint someone appropriate and substitute as well in case they're not around at the time. There can be a tendency, having dealt with these incidents and being involved at an early stage, to sort of panic. And from a very practical point of view, it's helpful having someone who understands exactly what the organisation's response should be in these types of situations. And people understand that they need to run any steps they might be thinking of taking by that person. In a panic, people may send a response email or try to delete something, whereas really they need to be understanding that they need to contact X person and no steps should be taken until that person has approved the action. So once that key person understands that there has been an incident, then they will want to assemble key personnel. That's almost always going to include senior management, your IT team, or a representative of your IT team, and your data protection officer. So for reasons I'll discuss in a little while, it really is imperative that someone within your organisation with a knowledge of data protection is aware of the incident and your obligations straight away. Depending on the nature of the incident and the extent to which it impacts employees individually, you may also want to include a HR representative as well. Externally, you may need to notify your insurer if you've got one. If you are uncertain on any of your legal obligations, including respect to data protection, or you feel like you need a bit more support on that, then you may want to involve external solicitors as well. Again, depending on the nature of the attack, there's various others who you may want to consider including. Quite often a cyber forensic expert. It may be beyond the everyday capabilities of your IT department. You may need someone who can come in and assist with the analysis of what's actually happened. You may need assistance from a PR agency if you are concerned that there may be negative press, social media postings. If you are concerned that you may get, for example, people ringing up your organisation to ask what happened, you may want to notify or get an appropriate response that you send to staff members who are on that front line, picking up phones, dealing with emails, so that they know how to respond to any questions. And then you may want to notify police, your banks, any regulators that you may have also. Once you've got the right people in place, you need to understand what happened, when it happened, how it happened and why it happened, and what the impact is as well. So if we have a case where a fraudster's cracked a password and has accessed an employee's laptop, is it only data on the laptop that's affected, or have they also managed to hack into your software or your servers more widely? Has the hacker deleted or stolen data? If so, what data have they taken? Does it include personal data? And if it does, whose personal data and what type of personal data? Is it sensitive personal data? Is a key consideration. You'll also want to consider whether any confidential or commercially sensitive information has been lost or stolen, and the impact that may have on your business if used contrary to your interests. You'll need to consider the impact of any stolen personal data on your employees or anyone whose personal data that you're holding. You'll need to consider the impact on them as well. And that may be not just from a data protection perspective, it may be from a very practical point of view. I was involved in an incident where payroll information had been taken. Now it was backed up, but there was a slight concern that they may not be able to pay employee wages, for example, because they had some key information missing. On the personal data front, a big concern, if there has been a hack or any type of cybersecurity incident generally, is if they have taken personal data, that there will then be ongoing identity theft. So there really needs to be consideration of the potential risks on your people. You then need to be considering, as part of this as well, what immediate steps you can take to contain the damage. Can you lock systems? Can you change passwords? Can you retrieve lost data? Do you have any control over lost data? You should have backups in place. How quickly can they get up and running? Can you get access to the information again, so that you can ensure continuity within your organisation, but also to protect your individuals. Another key consideration is going to be your legal obligations. So whenever a cyber attack occurs, you need to consider whether there's been a personal data breach for the purposes of the Data Protection Act or the UK GDPR. Personal data breach will arise whenever personal data is accidentally lost, destroyed, corrupted, or disclosed, or if someone has accessed the data or passed it on without proper authorization. So you need to consider whether the attack may have an adverse effect on your individuals. I mentioned identity theft. It doesn't need to be material. It could just be emotional as well. If, for example, you are processing sensitive data, health records, other records that the employee might feel concerned about if they end up in the public domain. If you consider that the attack is likely to risk people's rights and freedoms, you will need to notify the ICO. If you consider the risk to be high, then you need to notify the individuals in question as well. If it is notifiable, you've got a very short period of time in which to give those notices. It needs to be without undue delay. That's the first and foremost obligation upon you. So when I mentioned earlier about getting someone with data protection knowledge in place immediately, this is why the clock will start running. And you need to ensure that you are aware of that and you're dealing with this notification requirement. It's without undue delay, but not later than 72 hours. And it's from when you become aware of the breach. Any longer, and you need to be able to justify the delay. If you're still investigating and you don't yet know the level of the breach, then you can provide information to the ICO in phases also, and that happens quite a lot. You can imagine when the incident first happens, you don't have a massive amount of information. It will take a bit of investigating, the appointment of cyber forensics to start reviewing before you have a full picture. But you do need to be assessing whether you have enough and weighing up your risks as to whether you just notify based on the information you've got. Depending on the nature of the attack and the data that you hold, you'll also want to check your contracts with third parties and other duties that you may owe to third parties. There may, for example, be a term in a non-disclosure agreement requiring you to give notice of the other party of this type of incident to the extent it affects their confidential information. And you may also owe contractual obligations to data processors that you use or data controllers if you control data on behalf of a third party. So once you've reviewed, and as I say, this is very much an ongoing process, then you will want a plan of action in place to respond to the attack. Now, whilst you may have your instant response plan in place as part of your priority work that you've done, as AFA's ran through, this will need to be responsive to the incident in question, and so it will be chopped and changed as long as you're showing that you have ticked the boxes and you've done everything that you said you were going to do appropriate to the incident in question, then you're on the right track. So in terms of managing the incident, you've got your plan in place and you action it, you instruct who you need to instruct. You may not have needed to instruct lawyers initially. Now you want to get them involved because of your review process. If you feel that you need to report it to the ICO or to individuals, then you go ahead and do that. There will also be then management of any responses you receive, and that can be quite a big, depending on the number of individuals involved, that can be quite a big process. And so you may want someone specifically instructed to deal with the management of those responses to ensure consistency. You take whatever steps you can to contain the incident and to protect your organisation and people. That really is key. I've included that as part of this management slide, but straight off the bat, whatever you can be doing to contain, you need to be doing it. And as I say, this is all subject to ongoing review. It's a good idea if you've got your lead in place, they organise regular catch-up meetings with key people just to make sure everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing, that if there's any further information that's come to light, you can review, take a different step, go down a different route and take whatever action you need to do to protect your position. You need to document your decision making and the steps you took in response to the incident. It's a legal requirement, first and foremost, to keep records of security breaches. Just from a very practical point of view, though, and bearing in mind the interests of your organisation, do give careful consideration as to what you're committing to writing. Generally, you do want to keep the circle as small as you can, though there are circumstances in which you're going to need to brief your wider workforce. Obviously, if you need to notify them for data protection reasons, you're going to have to widen the circle. And as I mentioned earlier about PR issues, if you think you're going to get cold calls, then you might want to brief staff on what the organisation's line is on this. But if you do have a concern that you could be at fault in respect of this security breach, or that you may have breached any of your legal obligations, consider instructing lawyers to get involved on discussions about that. Communications with lawyers and sometimes others can be privileged in certain circumstances, meaning they wouldn't need to be provided to an opponent as part of a claim. A document shared between two managers, it could be disclosable. So if you have a report saying, look, this is what happened and we think we've completely messed up, if that report was actually prepared by a lawyer giving you advice on the reasons why they think you may have messed up, that could be privileged and it may not need to be disclosed to an opponent, whereas if that was done by an internal manager, it may need to be disclosed to an opponent. So it's very important that you do have a debrief following the event, look at what worked, what didn't, who would you put down on your list of key people if you were to do this again, who would to assemble if you had to go through the incident again. How could you make the review more streamlined? This is a particular area of interest for the ICO. With cybersecurity incidents, they will often send a questionnaire out to an organisation with different questions, and those questions will often focus on what you learned as a result of the breach and how you've implemented appropriate changes to prevent it happening again. Another concern for clients, and one that often outlasts the attack itself, is the ongoing claims. So AIFA mentioned action that may be taken by the ICO. They can investigate your compliance with data protection obligations, and they've got the power to impose sanctions, including considerable fines, as AIFA mentioned. In addition, you could be faced with claims from individuals seeking compensation as a result of a personal data breach. You may also have claims to consider yourselves, as in you may be able to bring claims against third parties. So you'll be wanting to consider whether the attack, or why the attack happened. Did it happen as a result of a failing by an IT contractor, for example, or was one of your data processes at fault? If it was one of your data processes, did they comply with their notification requirements to you? Did they do what they were supposed to do contractually? So that is something that you could again consider the lawyers, and if you have suffered losses, look to try and recover some of those that way. I've put claim against a wrongdoer there. In all reality, it's very, very hard to pursue a wrongdoer. They're usually professional fraudsters, and it's very difficult to identify them. The police would hopefully investigate the incident if it was of a criminal nature. But if you are able to identify the wrongdoer, in theory, it may be possible to take action against them. So it's one to bear in mind and take appropriate legal advice at the time. So that concludes my presentation. Hopefully that's a very practical approach to what you should do should you fall victim to a cyber attack. I can deal with any questions at the end, but for now, I shall pass you on to Jenny.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jenny Wade. I'm a Senior Associate in the Healthcare Commercial Team, and I'm just going to touch for a few minutes on best practice in the health and care sector. So I think, as we can see from what's been discussed already this morning, any sector, organisations in any sector can be the victim of a cyber attack. And AIFA's already discussed the risks which will impact organisations generally, but clearly in the health and social care sector, there's additional wider risks. So particularly the loss of sensitive patient health data, which could be very upsetting to the people impacted, and also delays and cancellations. Unfortunately, in the last few years, the NHS has experienced a couple of attacks which have been of quite of some significance. So the first one was WannaCry, which I'm sure we're all aware of because it was a worldwide ransom attack which targeted computers which were running the Microsoft Windows application, and it demanded ransom payments in Bitcoin. In this instance, Microsoft had actually previously released patches to prevent the issue, but there were many organisations which hadn't utilised those patches or hadn't appreciated the significance of needing to apply those patches. And the consequence of this was that the virus spread quite significantly on a worldwide basis. But the NHS was actually one of the most affected organisations. The implications in the short period when the virus was spreading were quite widespread and long-lasting. So despite the fact that in this particular instance no patient data was stolen, there was a significant impact on systems and access to services, meaning that there were then delays and cancellations. Patients had to travel further. For a period of time, NHS 111 was largely unavailable. So there was quite a substantial impact on the population as a whole. And then financial costs as well to the NHS, which related to having to provide additional IT support, restoring lost data in the systems which were affected by the attack, and then paying overtime to staff who had to work to try and catch up on the backlogs caused as a consequence of the attack. There was then a more recent attack on an organisation called Advanced last year. Advanced is an organisation which provides software to quite a number of different organisations within the health and care service. And again, despite the fact that the attack itself was relatively short-lived, the impact lasted well beyond the attack itself, and there were some systems which were inaccessible by parts of the NHS for up to a two-month period, which meant that access to patient data was impacted. Parts of the system had to be disconnected in order to try to contain the risk, which meant that patient records were unavailable, operations and appointments had to be cancelled, and there was a widespread impact on patients managing to obtain appointments, on ambulances getting out to patients, people being seen and people being able to get their prescriptions. So quite clearly, an attack on the NHS doesn't just impact the NHS organisations themselves, but also the general population, all of us being treated by the NHS. So these attacks have served to highlight the reliance of the health and social care sector on information technology. And following on from these attacks, quite a number of improvements have been mandated for the health and social care sector. Some of these are specific to health and social care organisations and what they're required to do, and some of the improvements are of wider application. But whether or not you're in a health or social care organisation or any other type of organisation, hopefully something I'm going to discuss in the next few minutes will be of use to you. Okay, so just starting with the health-specific requirements, and to run through these quite quickly. As you can see from the slide, there are a number of different requirements deriving from different sources, but they're all important to be considered by health and social care organisations. So the first are the National Data Guardian's data security standards, and the intention with these is to allow NHS organisations to identify, resist and respond to cyber attacks. They're probably not surprising given some of the things that Aoife and Kate have already talked about today, but in high-level terms, NHS organisations are required to have a strategy in place for protecting IT systems from cyber attacks. They're required to have that named senior executive who's responsible for cybersecurity and who any attacks would be notified to immediately, as Kate just said, and have in place a comprehensive business continuity plan to respond to cybersecurity incidents. There's then the cybersecurity strategy, which is very new. It was only introduced earlier this year. And this sets out 5 pillars which provide an overall approach to cybersecurity within the health sector up to 2030. And each of the 5 pillars has an associated desired outcome, a route to achievement, and organisational responsibility. So they go into quite a lot of depth and they're quite useful to have a look at. So the 5 pillars are to focus on the greatest risks and harms, which means considering the assets and services which could cause especially significant harm if disrupted by a cyber attack. Defend as one, so to try and share learning and collate data across the sector to develop that best practice on a national basis. People and culture, again, as we've touched on already, prioritising ensuring that staff are equipped with the skills and resources to address cyber threats. The 4th pillar is to build secure for the future, and this means embracing the opportunity when it arises to redesign system structures and technologies to have security at their very core, and then to be able to offer an exemplary response and recovery to any cyber attack. So to ensure that organisations are equipped to minimise the impact of a cyber attack and to try and minimise the time that it takes to recover from it. We then have something called the Data Security and Protection Toolkit. This is an online self-assessment tool which measures performance against those data security standards I just mentioned and helps organisations to understand the cybersecurity risks. And the DSP toolkit is now going to be used to measure progress of NHS organisations in meeting those 5 pillars under the cybersecurity strategy. Then, in addition to all of the requirements to sort of put in place to manage risk throughout your organisation, there are some tools that can be used by NHS organisations when contracting with suppliers to try and minimise the risk of a cyber attack. So when they are procuring goods and services, there is something called the Digital Technology Assessment Criteria. This is a list of criteria developed by NHS Digital, which are required to be used when organisations are procuring digital health tools. And this sets out a number of certifications which are required to ensure that suppliers to the NHS are secure and minimise any cybersecurity risk. And of itself requires suppliers to hold suitable cyber certifications. And then in terms of contractual requirements, there is a set of NHS terms and conditions for the supply of goods and services, which are a standard set which are widely used throughout the NHS. And again, these require suppliers to hold suitable cyber certifications and also require those suppliers to warrant that they will, that any software they supply is free from corrupt data, viruses, worms, and any other computer programs or code which might cause harm or disruption. So as you can see, within NHS organisations, cybersecurity really needs to be considered at all levels. Just thinking on a slightly wider level for a moment before we finish. Of wider application are the Network Information Systems Regulations 2018 and the National Cybersecurity Centre's Cyber Assessment Framework, which Aoife already mentioned slightly earlier. So both of these relate to operators of essential services, so the healthcare sector, but other organisations or sectors which provide vital services, such as utilities, for example. And these organisations need to make sure that they're managing risks and minimising the impact of incidents. So very similar to what we've seen already on a health-specific basis. But interestingly, the cyber assessment framework was originally set up to provide a framework for those operators of essential services, but this was widened back in 2019 to support wider use. As Aoife's already referenced, these are a set of 10 steps which are objectives to set out a way of assessing whether organisations meet the framework. It's quite useful to have a look at. It sort of sets out what good and bad look like, really. So it's quite a useful tool to use, and it is of wide application. So that was just a very quick run through of best practice within the NHS and the social care sector. But there are some quite useful tools there which build on the issues which Aoife and Kate raised earlier. And it is worth having a look at some of those sources of information, even if you're not within a health and social care organisation, because they do provide some quite useful indicators of best practice. Thank you. I'll now hand over to Jamie.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Kate and Aoife as well. That was very helpful. Hopefully that has provided some useful information for everybody about the regulatory environment, which is developing very quickly, escalating very quickly, and some practical tips, many of which you may be dealing with already, but perhaps some of them not, and what to do in the case of an incident. Apologies, we've run slightly over, but if anyone does have any questions quickly, do please put them in the chat and we'll see if we can answer them briefly. But if not, as I say, we will share the slides with everybody and always happy to consider follow-up questions by email as well. Okay, doesn't look like there's any questions. Everybody's probably all rushing off to other meetings. So let's call an end to it there. Thank you very much to everyone who dialed in, and look out for further information, insights, and webinar invitations in future for more on this topic. Thanks very much, everyone.